Everything old is new again. America's entertainment pop culture talk show.
It may well possess a rudimentary intelligence.
I'm trying to think, but nothing happens.
Felt a great disturbance in the force.
Hello, I'm Mr. Red.
Come on, bark like a dog for me.
Where's the goodies? Leave the gun. Take the cannoli.
I bet you wouldn't have done anything like this if Mom and Dad were here.
You filthy criminal.
Excuse me while I whip this out.
Go ahead. Make my day.
Here are your hosts, Douglas Viviani and David Cohen.
Welcome back to Everything Old is New Again. This is Douglas Viviani. You want to find out, learn about what happened with these great pyramids? How did they build these pyramids? Guess what? Read the book, The Secrets of the Great Pyramid. You want to find out, hey, wait a minute, what happened to King Tutt? What is all this about King Tutt? How did he die? He was a kid. What was that all about? Was it a murder? Well, read The Murder of Tutankhamun. Wait a minute. You want to find out about what's about the daily life of Egyptians, of the ancient Egyptians? What was that like? Well, you read the book, The Ancient Egyptians. How about, was there such a thing as Beatlemania before the Beatles? Yeah, there sure was. Egyptomania. People were going nuts, crazy, still are, about Egypt. Why, and what's it all about? Dr. Bob Brier has written all of those books, and more. He wrote The Cleopatra's Needles, which talks about the obelisks. You know, these things, they look like needles standing up in Paris, in New York, and of course in Egypt. I'm telling you, there's another one in London. And there's an older one we'll talk about in Italy and Rome. These are engineering feats. We're continuing with Dr. Bob Brier. Thank you, Dr. Brier, for being with us here again on Everything Old is New Again.
Good to be back.
There we go. And we're talking about the Luxor Obelisk and its voyage to Paris. It's a story that has origination in 1834, and there is a gentleman by the name of Labat who is in charge of all of this. He was ahead of his time. He was a techie. He was a nerd, if you will, and that's in the best sense of that word, that we appreciate nerds now, I think, in this day and age, for their intelligence and their ability to solve problems. He came across an interesting problem. He was a techie in that this gentleman back in the day, the steam engine was the space shuttle, the technology of the day. It was an amazing thing to people, but they hadn't figured out that, you know what, this rocket ship can go to the moon too, by the way, instead of just orbiting the Earth, if you will, right? They hadn't figured out that this steam engine might be something that could be used for other purposes, except for this fellow Labat, who you translated this book, The Luxor Obelisk, Dr. Brier, and he had the thought to use a steam engine. Unfortunately, for one reason or another, it was not able to be used in this project. Maybe you could touch upon that just a little bit to tease us as to that aspect of this story.
Sure. As you say, Douglas, he was a techie. He really was always looking for the newest thing. And he first arrives in Egypt around 1831, which is pretty early on for the steam engine. It's been used first on water. Steamers, steamships. That's how it really was used first. And then it took quite a while to realize this thing could really work pretty well on land, too, for railroads. So just recently, only 10 years before Labat, they're starting to have railroads. And they're realizing it can be used on land, but nobody has really exploited the possibilities of the steam engine for other things on land. I mean, that you can really have engines doing things on land for all kinds of work. And Labat gets the idea. He wants to do something remarkable when he finally gets the obelisk to Paris. He wants to erect it with a steam engine. And this is one of the reasons I translated the book. Nobody knows about this episode. When I'm reading this, I didn't know about it. Egyptologists don't know about it. He had a steam engine at the Place de la Concorde in Paris, and he was going to erect this obelisk with a steam engine. And he's thinking how marvelous it'll be to see it rise silently in the air with no human intervention. But they sent him a defective boiler. The thing couldn't gain enough pressure to lift the thing. So he says, whoop, back to capstans and winches. We're going to have to winch it up with guys. And he had plan B. He did have plan B, but he wanted to do this great thing with the steam engine. And that was Labat. He was always looking for the new thing, how to do it the best. He was a real techie. He went to a school, which was the École Polytechnique, which was the big, engineering college in the world practically, So he was really well trained and could do all kinds of things, but The steam engine was his only disappointment, I think, in this whole project.
And you know, he was, again, had a plan B, was able to overcome that. I thought that aspect of it was amazing, because you would think, all right, that's it. I'm going to use a steam engine, and here it is, and I've got it all set up, and engineering wise, whatever, and that's it. But meanwhile, that wasn't the case. So he did have the people to go ahead and man these capstans. What do they call them again?
Capstans. Yeah,
capstans.
Right.
And these circled things that you see, like maybe if you're watching, one of these movies, or the pirate movies.
Blackbeard the Pirate.
There you go. Yeah. They're pushing this thing around for energy, or to lift
to raise
the sail.
To raise the sails.
Right. Yeah. So, also Samson and Delilah, you see he was tortured after he lost his vision. And long story short, these things are all throughout, but you had to have them. You had to have these things handy, and so he made sure that there were enough, and we'll talk about that in another section, is that he only used 10, and in the past some others had to use many others. We'll talk about that in another section, but he was ready. So I think that's very interesting, and what a lesson, not only about the obelisk, but for all of us to move on and to learn about, there's always possibilities, and I think that's a great lesson. Another lesson was, this is interesting, the Rosetta Stone was discovered in 1799, and that allowed us to interpret basically the hieroglyphs from the Egyptians. Also, 88 years before King Tut's tomb was discovered by Howard Carter in 1922, there's Labat, who is, whether he interpreted it himself, he had someone interpret, I think is what you're saying, the hieroglyphs on the Luxor Obelisk. It wasn't just an engineer, because most engineers may have just said, yeah, whatever, we're here for this obelisk, let's just take it. They wouldn't have read it, they wouldn't have had it interpreted, they wouldn't have had to figure out, hey, wait a minute, what is this thing all about? Why are we even moving it? Why is it so important, right?
Yes, one of the reasons I fell in love with Labat is he's a full human being. I mean, he's a culture vulture. He's interested in the Egyptians as people. He's interested in the culture. He wants to learn everything he can about Egypt. And he's not just this sort of Frenchman coming in as being a superior and just let's get the obelisk and go home. No, he wants to find out everything he can about everything.
Yeah, and then he did find out what is on this obelisk, and basically that it was ordered, if I'm right about this, I'm going to throw this at you here, at the Pharaoh Ramses II, and thereafter, sort of about, I would say 3/4 of the way through of the inscriptions on this obelisk, it looks like he passed away, and Ramses III, the one that came after him, of course, he continued the inscriptions, but didn't continue to honor his predecessor. He then continued just saying, and by the way, I'm the one that finished this, always raising their hand, right, to take credit.
Well, that's often the case with pharaohs. They never pharaohs never completed their predecessors' monuments. They wanted to do their own thing. And actually, the translation that Labat has in his book is a little wonky. It's a little wobbly, because Champollion had just started deciphering the hieroglyphs. So it's not exact translation. It's pretty good, gives you an idea of it, but don't take it too literally. That's what I'd say. But let me tell you one interesting, you mentioned the hieroglyphs. One of the things that Labat discovered that nobody knew about is, as you say, the obelisk is erected by Ramses II, Ramses the Great. And on the obelisk are his names, all of his names, and he says how wonderful he is. But Ramses, Egyptologists often call him the Great Chiseler. Now, the reason we call him the Great Chiseler is when he saw somebody else's monument, he often chiseled their name off and put his name on it, claiming it as his, right? So we call him the Great Chiseler. So Ramses knew that this could happen to him, too. So what does he do? He does two things. One is he chisels his name deeper than the rest of the monument to make it much harder to chisel off. But the other thing that Labat discovered, when he took the obelisk down, now the obelisk is resting on a pedestal that's just a little bit bigger than the obelisk. He takes the obelisk down, and on the top of the pedestal, underneath where the obelisk was standing, Ramses has carved his name, where it was hidden. Nobody knew it was there because nobody could come and carve it off, and therefore he would have his monument forever. So then all of a sudden, for the first time in 3,300 years, we discover, look, there's Ramses' cartouche right on the top of the pedestal. So that's kind of cool. So now when you go through Egypt and you see an obelisk, with Ramses, underneath it is probably his name.
He was a piece of work. Was that the Ramses that was in power and alive till like the 90s and fathered, hundreds of children? Is that the one we're thinking of?
Yeah, Ramses had just roughly 100 children. Yeah, Ramses the Great lived well into his late 80s, early 90s, and was very proud of the number of kids. On the temple, for example, where these obelisks stood, with the Luxor Temple, he has a long, long wall which shows all of his sons, and each one has a name and this and that. So he's very proud, very proud. And
this Ramses III, was he a relation?
Well, Ramses III, actually, the one who follows Ramses II is Merenptah, another son, and then we get Ramses III, who really isn't related at all. Ramses III is no.
Okay, I see. All right, well, this is so interesting. We're going to continue because there's so much more to the story that we're not talking about, that we will cover some of it, but you've got to get this book. I'm telling you, it is a great read, The Luxor Obelisk and its Voyage to Paris. We will be back right after this. And everything old, do again with Dr. Bob Brier.
You're listening to Everything Old is New Again, America's entertainment pop culture talk show with Douglas Viviani and David Cohen.
33 centuries had passed since human feet last trod the floor on which we stood, and yet the signs of recent life were around us. A half-filled bowl of mortar, a blackened lamp, the chips of wood left on the floor by a careless carpenter. So gorgeous was the sight that met our eyes. A golden effigy of the young king of magnificent workmanship filled the whole of the interior.
There we go. That's Howard Carter, 1922, when they found King Tut's tomb and discovered it. But he was not the first. Of course, ancient Egypt goes back a long way. There's been many people interested and many people trying to bring this civilization to light. One of them is this gentleman by the name of Labat, who is the subject of Bob Brier's book. Dr. Bob Brier is bringing to us the Luxor Obelisk and its voyage to Paris, and he interpreted this book, and which is basically, what would we say, it's more than a diary. Certainly it's more like an adventure story. It has lessons in ancient Egypt history, talking about technology of the day. It's an adventure story, but it basically was a diary, no?
It was an account, a day-to-day almost account of what was happening when Labat was in Egypt. Yeah, it gives daily life incidents. It doesn't just give the taking down of the obelisk and we got it to Paris. It's not that kind of thing. He tells about his adventures in Egypt. He goes on a big trip. He takes a 7-month voyage all the way south into Nubia and wants to see the monuments. He's an adventurer. He talks about his interactions with the people. He's somebody who interacted with people, which most foreigners didn't do. He had to hire hundreds of workers to get this obelisk down. And he's really caring about the people, which is he's really a humanitarian. He's a wonderful guy. That's why I fell in love with him and thought I had to translate his account.
Yeah, sure. He paid people that weren't usually paid and paid them a fair wage, too. So he was ahead of his time in that way, ahead of his time in many ways. The book is divided up into 4 different sections. Just to give me an idea, and I want to get into section 2 in 2 seconds from now, but just to give you an idea, they talk about the visit to Egypt, how they got there, the ship, taking the obelisk down, and then they talk about, we'll talk about this in a minute, but I believe, I don't know if it was the Nile, I guess it was not high enough yet, so there was some time off that Labat had, and then visited Nubia, which is down south from where he was. And certainly there were no excursions, there was no tourism back then. He did it for his own information, and we'll talk about what he found there in a moment. There was also a section about getting into Paris, the 3rd section, and unloading it, and then there's a third, and erecting the obelisk, and then there's a story or an interpretation of the obelisk that was brought to Rome and raised by a fellow by the name of Fontana in 1586. I guess we'd say about 250 years prior, and how we compare that to what Labat did. But let's focus just for this section for a moment on his visit. Think about this. You're hired to do this job, this monumental task, and now for one reason or another, you're slowed down and you've got to kind of relax. You can't do what you need to do on the next step. So rather than just hang out and have champagne and caviar or whatever you want to say, relax on your laurels, so to speak. Look how great we are. We're just about there. All we need to do is get on the high seas and bring this back. He took an excursion. I think it was months and months that he went and explored more of ancient Egypt, or at least southern Egypt. Tell us what he found there in terms of a dance that he fell in love with.
The dance. Yes.
And so forth. But
let me set the setting, though. You're right. He what happened was when they were going to put the obelisk in the ship, their plan was to run the ship aground, to really get it on land, practically, to go right into the bank of the Nile, right on the side, and have it run aground. Now, the Nile rises once a year, around July. It rises about 30 feet. So they run the ship aground, the Nile goes down, and the ship is on solid ground, which is good. They get the obelisk in the ship, but now they have to wait for the Nile to rise the 30 feet before the ship can be floated off the bank. So they're going to have to wait about half a year. So they decide, let's go on an excursion south of Luxor, into the borders of Egypt and past the borders into Nubia, what was called then Nubia, which today we might call the Sudan, almost the Sudan. So they're adventurers, and they're going off into Nubia because Labar wants to see these monuments. Very few people have gone that far south. And he wants to see Abu Simbel, the great rock-cut mountain, that Ramses the Great had carved, which is, by the way, Ramses carves this there are 4 67-foot-high statues of Ramses the Great carved into a mountain. I mean, really impressive. And that's the model, I feel, or the inspiration for our Mount Rushmore. That's where we get the idea of Mount Rushmore. So he wants to see that, and he's going on an excursion. He takes some of his men with him, and they head south in boats, looking at the monuments. Now, one of the things about Labar, and you mentioned the dance, one of the things that I find so funny and so humanizing about Labar is he's going through the various towns and he meets people and he talks to them. He sees a funeral. He describes it. He's kind of like an anthropologist also. He's describing the customs of the people. And they witnessed a troupe of itinerant dancers, the Almes, he calls them. Now, really, what he's going to see is the precursor of the modern striptease. It's a striptease dance that he sees. It's called the Dance of the Bee. And you have this small troupe of maybe 3 or 4 people. There's a dancer who has all these veils on, and she's well covered. And you have somebody beating a drum and some playing a reed instrument. And she starts dancing. And it's a typical Orientalist dance. She's dancing. And all of a sudden, and the reason it's called the Dance of the Bee, she pretends that a bee is bothering her. So she's using her hands to flick away the bee, and she's running away from it. And then it seems as if it gets under one of her veils. So she throws off the veil. She keeps dancing. Another veil comes off, and the veils keep coming off till she's practically naked, and she faints on the ground, and someone covers her with a robe or a blanket. And Labar goes wild. He thinks it's the greatest thing he's ever seen. He's just enthralled with this Dance of the Bee and this early striptease dance. And what I found fascinating was, with Labar on this trip, was one of the ship's officers who also witnessed the Dance of the Bee. And he later wrote an account of this, and he said, oh, it's so much better than modern ballet where these women are off balance and things. He said, this is much better. So these guys went nuts over the Dance of the Bee.
And there's a description of it in detail, like there was in the book. He didn't just say, oh, we just saw this dance. He wanted to tell you.
Makes it fun. Yeah, he gives the details. He gives the details of that. And you can see the human being of Labar coming through. Even, for example, when Labar landed in Alexandria, Egypt, for the first time, 1831, he has to meet with the Pasha, Muhammad Ali, who's ruling Egypt. And apparently, Labar is very short. When I say very short, I mean very short. I would guess under 5 feet. And when he meets with Muhammad Ali has a bit of a sense of humor, and he pretends not to see Labar. He says, where is this engineer who's here to move this obelisk? Where is this engineer? And constantly, Labar is sort of being teased about his height, even when he comes to Luxor for the first time, and the locals are all around him. And they say, who's the man who's going to move this obelisk? Everybody knows it can't be moved. It's impossible. And they say, oh, it's Labar, this man, this engineer. And one of the locals says, he's not as big as my walking stick. He can't move this obelisk. So we get a sense that, he's a little bit bothered by his height, but he's willing to mention it and say, this is part of the thing.
And certainly wasn't lifting it on his back, fellas. You know what I mean?
Right, exactly.
He was lifting it on the back of his brain, if you will, or the strength of his brain and his engineering forte. And I think that's what's interesting, because when in the fourth section of the book, let me just, before I get to that, because was there anything else besides the Dance of the Bee that he found in those 4 to 6 months that he went down south that's of consequence, or did he just enjoy the people during that time?
Well, he's enjoying the people, but also he's studying the monuments. And remember, he's a techie. He's trained as an engineer from the École Polytechnique. So what he tends to do when he goes to a temple like Abu Simbel, the one that's way south, carved into the mountain of Ramses the Great, he tends to measure everything. He loves doing that. They're measuring everything, taking records, because he wants to report when he gets back all the details. So he's doing two things. He's meeting the people, the customs of the people. He sees a funeral. He describes it. He meets a holy man and talks to him. He's talking about all kinds of things that he sees along the way.
So we will continue. I'm going to tease you a little bit because I want to do this right. There's a juxtaposition of the move of the obelisk to Rome and how that was handled in the 1500s, late 1500s, and Lebas' comparison to that, and some real interesting stories about that transition. And I'm telling you, this book is something that it is. You can hear this conversation is not dry. If you were to tell someone, that you're reading a book about the move of the obelisk, their eyebrow will go up. Either they're going to say, "What's an obelisk? Are you talking about ancient Egypt moving? Who moved it? Why did it move? What?" There are so many questions just by saying that question or statement to someone. I'm telling you, that and more come alive. There's so many avenues of interest in this book called The Luxor Obelisk and Its Voyage to Paris. And overall, it is the human being, human condition, human mind, human intellect, overcoming unbelievable obstacles. And we'll be back to discuss that on Everything Old's New Again.
Now, if I'd known they'd line up just to see him, I'd taken all my money and bought me a museum. Buried with a donkey. He's my favorite honky.
It's funny, I saw him 1978, Nassau Coliseum, the first concert at 16 years old that I ever went to see, and he sang that song, and it was a big hit.
Really?
And unfortunately, or fortunately, whatever, that started my interest in Egyptology, believe it or not.
Wow.
How crazy is that?
Oh.
Shows you where I'm coming from, the lunatic I am. But, I mean, that would just, who knows where the inspiration comes from, but who cares? It really is, it's just... It's endless.
What life's about.
Exactly, and it's endless. So, all right, so we'll have one section, 22 minutes, we'll bang it right out, but it'll go before you know it in no time. But to me, there's so much more to the book. It's just...
Now, if I'd known they'd line up just to see him, I'd taken all my money and bought me a museum.
You're listening to Everything Old is New Again, America's entertainment pop culture talk show with Douglas Viviani and David Cohen.
And we're back here on Everything Old is New Again with Dr. Bob Brier talking about the Luxor Obelisk and its voyage to Paris. If you want to read a companion, if you will, to this, Cleopatra's Needles, The Lost Obelisks of Egypt. These are amazing books, stories, adventures. Also, read Egyptomania, The Ancient Egypts. You read one of these books, you're going to want to read them all, I'm telling you. The Murder of Tutankhamun, The Secret of the Great Pyramid, How One Man's Obsession Led to the Solution of Ancient Egypt's Greatest Mystery. How about that? These are some great books by Dr. Bob Brier, B-R-I-E-R, if you're looking on Google, let's say, to find these books. And, of course, the latest. He translated this book, and it is a great adventure, The Luxor Obelisk. He was, this gentleman, Lebas, is someone that was retained by and honored later on by the French to move the Luxor Obelisk and move it into Paris. So if this was going to be any kind of a mistake, if there was going to be a problem, even though there was I mean, there was media, but there wasn't mass media like we have now. Word would have gotten out. And boy, did he have any trepidation? Did he talk? I didn't see it in the book where he talked about in the beginning, should I take this on or not? It seems like he dove into this without even hesitation.
Yes, he was rather confident, I think, Douglas. He was really quite confident. And I think the reason he was confident, it wasn't hubris. It wasn't just that he had a high opinion of himself, but he was one of the first people ever to be able to do the calculations to know precisely what was needed to move an obelisk. So he had a little bit of a surety with him because he knew, I know what's needed.
And that lends us perfectly right into the fourth section of the book where they talk about this gentleman Fontana, who's an Italian architect.
Right.
But I don't necessarily think he was an engineer, and there's a difference because from what I understand and from reading the translation in this great book, the Luxor Obelisk, you can see how Fontana's position in 1586 was to throw everything he's got at it, maybe 600 to 900 people, 100 of these capstans, which are these, kind of wheels that need to be moved and moved and moved round and round by like 10 people each capstan to raise and lower the obelisk. And yeah, he got it done. But there's a great story there. Before I get to the story, I just want to talk about the idea that compared to Labat, who looked at that, saw that, and said, you know what, this fellow didn't really know what he was doing all that much. I can learn from him, but he, with his calculations, he only needed 10 of these capstans. Of course, he wanted to, we talked about, use the steam engine, but without using the steam engine, he still knew just need 10 of these capstans and it'll work, right?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. Now, Labat is going to move his obelisk around 1832, 1831. And the next nearest obelisk that had been moved in time was this guy Fontana in 1586. So nobody had moved an obelisk in 250 years. Now, when Fontana moves it, he really doesn't know what he's doing. He's an architect and he's smart. But, for example, he has no idea how much force is needed to lower this obelisk. He has no idea how much force is needed to raise the obelisk. So what he does, is he does overkill. He builds, this huge, what he called the castello, the castle. It's a scaffolding around the obelisk that was so large that it had to take an entire forest to supply the wood. And like you said, when he has these winches, these capstans, these turning wheels, which generate the force, he has no idea how much power they're generating. So he puts in 100. He's got 100 of these capstans with horses and men pulling them both. And it's just a zoo. There's so many people around this thing, and he throws so much weight at it, that he gets it. He succeeds. He does succeed. But he literally doesn't know what he's doing. So now Fontana comes in, and Fontana, with his École Polytechnique education, can do the calculations. He is the first one to move an obelisk who knows what it takes. He is the first one to know, oh, yeah, I can do this.
Well, what gave him that, if I can interrupt you, sure. What gave him that education? Where did he come from to know this information that most others would not have known?
Well, what's happened is we have a big surge forward in mathematics and engineering. We get Newton and Leibniz inventing the calculus simultaneously. So now calculations can be done that couldn't have been done before, right? So he's got all of this math background, and he goes to the best engineering school in the world, the École Polytechnique, where they're teaching him calculus, they're teaching him this, and he is the first one to be able to figure out, well, we're going to have to account for friction on the ropes. There's going to be some friction. That's going to slow us up a bit. Well, by now they know how to calculate friction on ropes, how thick the rope is, what it's made of. So he's got all these calculations that he can do, and he knows, I don't need 100 capstans. I can do it with 10. And he's really quite confident about that. And he's also very proud of that. He is so proud that he includes at the back of his book an appendix which gives all the calculations.
Right.
Now, one of the things I say in my introduction to this book, my colleague Colette and I did this translation. And one of the things we say in the introduction is, I don't expect anybody to read this section on the calculations. But Labat was so proud to put in these calculations, the formulas he used, and all of this. Just take a glance at it and you'll see how proud he was, because he's showing people, this is what modern engineering can do.
Right.
So he's really a techie.
It's so interesting. It's maybe the last 5 pages of the book that he does calculations all over the place. And I'll tell you what, if I have an 11-year-old, we're almost there. She started to maybe do calculus in a year or two. I'm going to pull a couple of these out and see if we can solve them or see if they make any sense. Because all these years later, for me from school, they don't make any sense anymore. But when you dive into calculus and you're interested in it, that's another aspect that might be interesting in this book, along with a story about Fontana back in 1586 when they were raising this obelisk or lowering it. I can't remember which it was. There was so much stress on the ropes. Sextus V was the Pope at the time and had said there's going to be complete silence during this. And there was a fella that had the courage, saw these ropes straining so much that he had the courage to raise his hand and say what? To save the day.
Well, he said water on the ropes. That's the mythology of it. We're not sure if it's true.
Right.
But supposedly an old sailor cries out from the crowd, water on the ropes, water on the ropes. Not sure it's true, but it's a good story.
It is a memorable story. It's in the book. And there's so many more than just that story and the dance of the bees and so forth in this book. We're just touching the tip of the iceberg here with all of these stories and background.
Yeah.
But I just think it's interesting that there was no need to wet the ropes during Labar's time. He had it down to a science.
Labar really knew what he was doing. And I think one of the other things that gives you an aspect to Labar, and it's true of all I think engineers in those days, they had training in how to draw, in drafting. And Labar did these beautiful diagrams and illustrations of the machinery he needed to lower the obelisk, the winches, the capstans, and he even has drawings of Luxor Temple and how the obelisk was being pulled on this special roadway they made. They actually had to take down an entire village that was built right in front of the temple to make way for the obelisk to go to the ship. So he had to take down an entire village of mud brick houses, and he paid the people for their houses. He didn't just kick them out and say, the Pasha has sent me. And when he hired his workmen, he paid them. And even there's a lovely story, a lovely, lovely story. He's hiring the workmen, not for much money. They didn't need much money, but he hires them, and a blind woman comes to him and says, I can't work with you. I'm blind, but I can pray for you for success. And he says, okay, we'll hire you too. So he hires the blind woman too to pray for their success. He really cared about the people. So it's a wonderful story on many, many fronts. But I think his illustrations are also something that really adds to it. And I was very fortunate. The publisher, which is AUC Press, American University in Cairo Press, they publish a lot of books about Egyptology. They were willing to put the money into it to make it a really beautiful book. It's an oblong-shaped book so that you can see the illustrations, the long illustrations. And it's really, they spent, they didn't scrimp on this one. They gave you really good paper, color illustrations. So it's really, it's not my book, it's Labar's book. So I could say it's a wonderful book.
Now, are all the illustrations Labar, or are there some of them with it looks like maybe a computer interpretation of them, or are they all him in his own handwriting?
Most of Labar. There are just a couple that I brought in from outside, but almost all are by Labar. They're drawn so well that they do look like they're computer drawn or whatever.
Yeah.
But no, they're most Labar. Yeah, they're Labar.
And he wrote most of these inscriptions during his time in Egypt, or did he do it when he came back?
He took careful notes when he was in Egypt. He took careful notes. That would be what you'd call a diary. But when he got back, 2 years later, he published his account, of how they moved the obelisk, and that's when he publishes it. So that's when I think he polishes it. He writes very well. One of the things that was easy for us in translating, sometimes you're translating a book and the guy has very bad syntax. It's awkward. He struggles with things. Labar says things very nicely. I'll give you an example of this kind of wit. The men are about to lower the obelisk. It's October 25th. They're about to lower the obelisk, and they put up flags on top, French flags on top of the obelisk. They've got the winches, and they're all ready to start. And they jump up and put on those French flags on top of the obelisk, and they say, "Now it is Paris's obelisk." And Labar says to them, "Don't sell the bear skin until you kill the bear." Yeah, they're a little premature. Putting your flag on it doesn't make it Francis. You got to get it over there.
It ain't over till it's over. He was Yogi Berra before his time, huh?
That's right.
We'll be back right at this. Everything goes new again with Dr. Bob Brier.
You're listening to Everything Old is New Again, America's entertainment pop culture talk show with Douglas Viviani and David Cohen.
And we are here talking with Dr. Bob Brier about all things the Luxor Obelisk and the subject of this book, a gentleman by the name of Labat, and what he was all about. He was a lot of things before his time, and I could tell that you really enjoyed spending time with him through his writing. It seems like he poured out more, of course, than just the engineering onto these pages, and it comes alive where you really kind of, it's almost like listening to his story. It's a long story, but it's almost like sitting down listening to the story as he's telling you at the fireside or something like that, if that makes sense.
Well, it would make a nice radio show. Uncle Labat, read us another story, and tell us about the one about the bear. Tell us the one about the dance of the bee. Tell us the one about this, the crack in the obelisk. Tell us about this. So there are loads of wonderful, wonderful episodes in this thing, and I think it's because Labat is just this terrific guy. I visited his grave. Labat is buried in Paris. There's a cemetery in Paris called Père Lachaise, which is really for the dignitaries of France, and he's buried there with a wonderful obelisk on top of his grave.
And there's a picture of it in the book.
Huh?
There's a picture of it in the book.
Yeah, I paid my respects to Apollinaire Labat, a great man.
Good for you. How did you find that? I guess with Google it's easy enough to find, or how did you find it?
Nowadays you can find anything, and you can go into Père Lachaise in France, and there are guides even who, if you have a particular grave you want to see, they'll take you to see it or whatever. And I visited Labat's grave, and at the same time I visited some of the men who were with Napoleon in Egypt. They're buried there also. So I had a good sort of Egyptomania tour through Père Lachaise.
Wow, that's interesting. Also, just to finish up, what's interesting is in the end of the book, Labat himself says that there were a few jealous souls who tried to hinder his work, but he's not going to focus on that. He wants to pay tribute and pay back the debt of gratitude he has to all of those who helped him. So he downplays those that tried to hinder the work, that were jealous. And there's two questions. And firstly, it's interesting that he then lists in the book the amount of money that different people got that worked with him. And I think he did that as a tribute, I think. I'm wondering why he would do that. And then he got like 4,000 francs, was it, for this?
Yes, he's very proud of it. He's very proud of it. And even, I think what he's most proud of, perhaps, is that the King of France strikes a medal in commemoration of the obelisk being erected on the Place de la Concorde and puts Labat's name on the back of it. He's there. Labat is mentioned with the King of France. And that, boy, it doesn't get any better than that for a Frenchman in 1836.
Exactly. But which is a great way for him to be honored, there's no doubt, and he appreciated that. So this follows up with two questions. Number one, first, about the naysayers. Did it ever come to light in any of your investigation of others that said, I'm going to make this up now, that I don't think this is true, but just let's follow up, that he didn't do what he said he did, that this wasn't true, that he shouldn't be honored because of this? Like, why were they naysayers? And what were they saying?
To tell you the truth, I'm not 100% sure, because Labat never says exactly what it is.
Okay.
But I have a hunch. One of the only thing that Labat was tasked with, his job, was to bring the obelisk back to France. He was not given the job of erecting it at the Place de la Concorde.
Interesting.
Somebody else was going to do that, I think. And maybe they saw that here we got this Apollinaire Labat who is so capable, who can, conquer anything thrown at him, that we better have this guy erecting it on the Place de la Concorde. So maybe, just maybe, because he's given the job of erecting on the Place de la Concorde, which wasn't originally his task, maybe somebody who's pushed aside feels bad about it. Maybe.
That really, see, that's why you're the man, because that certainly does make sense. What could have been.
I think it's very interesting that they didn't ask him to do the whole thing. In other words, when London sent their guy, he's supposed to bring it back and erect it. When New York sent our guy, Gorange, he goes there and brings it back and erects it. But Labat was only supposed to go there, bring it back, and that's it. Somebody else was going to erect it, but they decided, nope, this guy's the one to do it.
Well, again, ahead of his time, he laid the groundwork for the others that followed. Now, the others that followed, the one that did London, the one that did New York, and again, those are listed in Cleopatra's Needles, the Lost Obelisks of Egypt that you wrote and published. It's a tremendous book. It's so fun hearing about how they had the obelisk going through the city of New York and the streets of New York, but that's a story for another time. But the question is, did they... It doesn't sound like they had access to what you've done here with us and brought to us now. So did they learn from him in some way? Did they write to him? Did they, consult with him, or did they take this upon themselves?
No, Labar was dead by the time they're moving their obelisks.
Okay.
And his method was really quite different from theirs in certain ways. And actually, Labar, with his simplicity, I think had less problems than they did. For example, when London brings over their obelisk, it's literally lost at sea. They lost it for a day. They hit a hurricane, a gale, and they had to cut it free. It was in this case on a cigar tube like thing, and they're towing it by steamer, and they had to cut it free. And when they go back to try to find it, they can't find it. And some other ship picked it up. So other people had more trouble, I think, than Labar. So they didn't really learn that much from him, I think.
Were they aware of him? I mean, because this is a different time and age. I'm not sure that they even would have been aware of him all that much, or all of this story. They wouldn't have known, would they have?
Well, one thing Gorringe would have. I know that Gorringe, the man who moved the New York obelisk, owned a copy of Labar's book that I translated.
Holy smokes! Okay,
yeah,
wow.
I have that book, the book of Labar, the original book by Labar, and it has Gorringe's signature in the title page on the front page. So Gorringe owned it. So I know he would have read Labar's, but he was a little bit deprecating of Labar. He said, now, why didn't Labar use a hydraulic jack to get the thing up or whatever? He's had his own method, but they didn't learn that much from Labar. Labar did it, and he's my man.
That's amazing. And just following that up, that book that you have, you're saying, was the original book. That
by
was
Labar.
By Labar, but also was the one that the New York gentleman had.
Owned, the New York engineer who owned it, yes.
How did you get your hands on that one?
I saw it in a book dealer's catalog in New York, and I thought, I had to have this one.
That's amazing. That's like some of the autographs people have on their walls or whatever from people. That's a real piece of. That's even more than that, because this is a real piece of history. That's amazing.
Yes, it is.
Holy smokes! Well, I'm glad that we've had the time to go through history, to go through a little touch of ancient Egypt, to go through some engineering, go through some human stories. All of that and more are listed in and great reading of the Luxor Obelisk and its voyage to Paris by Dr. Bob Brier. This book it's got more to it than we're even talking about here, and we filled 2 shows. So, Doctor, has something else to add, too, because I think there's even more to talk about.
It's been great fun. No, thank you. I just want to say one thing. If you're looking for the book, it's not by me. I didn't write it. I'm just the translator. So if you want to find it on Amazon or anywhere, it's Apollinaire Lebas, Lebas. It's his book. It's his story. And that's why I feel okay saying it's a wonderful tale.
That's a good point. You could actually look it under the title, The Luxor Obelisk. I found it under that. But also forget the first name, because I don't want to, you shouldn't forget it. But you're not going to, on the radio, remember this. But you can remember Lebas, Lebas, right? Just look up Luxor and Lebas, Lebas, and you'll definitely find this book. Of course, you can look up, if you got a pen and a piece of paper, The Luxor Obelisk and its voyage to Paris. Lebas, Lebas, is the author, translated by Dr. Bob Brier. And I apologize, I mispronounced, I know I did, your co-translator's name. Maybe you can help me out with that.
Colette doesn't usually use her middle name even, as a matter of fact. She dropped it in at the end. It's Colette Sumner.
Well, that's easy. That I can do. The middle name mixed me up there before last show. So, and anyone listening to our show knows that's one of the only deficiency that I have is mispronouncing names. I'll say that facetiously, but I do the best that I can. Sometimes it's embarrassing, but it's not embarrassing. It's totally and completely enjoyable to have Dr. Bob Brier back on Everything Old is New Again for 2 shows. You want to hear an old shows or previous shows, you can go to any of the podcast locations and just put up Everything Old is New Again and Dr. Bob Brier, B-R-I-E-R, and you'll find our old shows. It's also on YouTube. You can also get it through our website, everythingoldisnewagain.biz. But better than that, we're happy that you've had the time to listen to us on the radio, to make different kind of radio, fun radio, interesting radio, and now all of that can apply to the reading of the Luxor Obelisk. Dr. Bob Brier, thank you so much for your time. We really enjoyed it.
Great to be back again, Douglas. Take care.
We're looking forward to there's always another project, so we're going to enjoy this project, store this project on our memory banks, and we're looking forward to the next one. Just give us a hint. Do you think you have anything coming up that you in the future?
I do indeed.
Good.
I'll give you the hint. It has something to do with the 100th anniversary coming up.
Excellent. We will Google that in a few moments, find out what that means, and we will be happy to have you back when that's next and on the board. But right now, again, the Luxor Obelisk, look for Lebas as the author. I'm telling you, you are not going to be sorry that you bought this, and you're going to be the smartest person in the room after you read this book, at least about this topic. Again, Dr. Brier, thank you for your time. We look forward to having you back, and Everything Old is New Again.
Thanks, Douglas.
All
Bye.
Right. Come on back next week. Same bat time, same bat station.
Well, this is Karen Allen from Raiders of the Lost Ark and Zarman, and I'm here to tell you about my wonderful store and website, KarenAllenFiberArts.com. It's KarenAllen-FiberArts.com. I carry all kinds of really unique gifts and women's clothing lines from all over the world, from small studios that are things you won't see anywhere else. And if you're looking for a gift or something for yourself, please get in touch with us. We would love to help you find that special thing.
That's KarenAllen-FiberArts.com. You've been listening to Everything Old is New Again, America's pop culture entertainment talk show. Find us on the web at everythingoldisnewagain.biz. That's .biz.
See you next week. Same bat time, same bat station.